Hello. Welcome to the League of Women Voters and the American Association of University Women's Pros and Cons Forum on local and state ballot measures for the 2024 November election. I'm Shane Stark. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. I'm here. My partner, Claire Von Blaricum, is manning the chat box, so people that are watching can send questions into the chat and we'll answer them at various points during the presentation. Let's get started. I guess, there we go. I want to thank the voters for watching, and I want to thank the League of Women Voters of California, that's our state league, for preparing these slides on the state measures. We've also got some slides that we added on the local measures so you can have a more rounded picture. Next slide. There we go. Here's a slide that tells you what pros and cons are. In simple language, it's unbiased, nonpartisan explanation of the state ballot measures entitled to create an understanding of issues, context, and arguments so that you can make an informed decision on this very complicated matter. I may note that during the course, we may be compelled to invoke our mysterious AI chatbot to provide art criticisms as appropriate on the graphics that were provided by the State League. Next slide. I would note that the program is presented by us, the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara, and our co-sponsor, AAU Santa Barbara Goleta Valley. To enable you to follow this, the blue slides were prepared by the State League of Women Voters of California Education Fund, and the other slides were prepared by us. I note that the purpose is solely informational and educational about the ballot measures. The League does not endorse any candidate or political parties. As I mentioned, we will explain the measures as they come up, and questions can be raised in the chat. Next slide. This is where you can get your information about the ballot measures in greater detail. There's the pros and cons. I'm going to hold them up. Well, you can't see them because there you go. They look like this. They look like this, and you can get them online at that website. Vote 411 has a raft of information for new and busy voters. And if you want to go to the text itself of the proposition, the official ballot language and arguments are available on the website for the Secretary of State for California. It just lists all the official material one after another. Okay, we've covered that. We're going to do it as follows. We're going to have a brief background on local government. We're going to go through our local tax increases and bonds and measures with an emphasis of the two that most directly affect the city of Santa Barbara. And then we'll go through the state propositions, all 10 of them. There are 10 state propositions. And again, put the questions in the chat. We like questions, incidentally. This is a basic primer on California local government. The powers of the various government agencies come straight from the California Constitution. We have counties, which are subdivisions of the state and perform state functions and services, notably health and welfare at a local level, and provide general government in unincorporated areas of the county, like, for example, Montecito in the southern part of the county and Orcutt in the northern part of the county. Cities are municipal corporations. There are two kinds. There are charter cities, like the city of Santa Barbara, or general law cities, like the city of Goleta. All municipal corporations have tax, police, and corporate powers. The measures that we're going to be looking at today are mostly about the tax power, with some regulatory matters also on the ballot measures. The local stuff is pretty much all about taxes. Get the next slide. As you probably know, the separation of powers of the branches of government has a system whereby the legislature in California, we have a state senate and the state assembly, makes the laws, it passes the laws, they are signed and executed by the governor. And there's some executive branch departments that report to the governor. However, and this is why presumably you're here, there are three great rights that are reserved to the people of the state of California. The first is the initiative, which is the power of citizens to sign measures and write laws and have them adopted by popular vote. The second is a referendum. A referendum is a vote on whether you approve or don't approve a law that has already been passed by the legislature. We don't have any referendums. I think the plural of referendum is either referendums or referenda. Never been sure about that. But in any event, we don't have any on the ballot. And last, recall. The power of a recall is the power of the voters to petition to remove an officer before their term expires. Don't have any of those on the ballot either. We would note that what you're going to see in the measures that are before you include fully half of them are constitutional amendments that were referred by the legislature. They're not initiatives. They're the ones that have the numbers 2 through 6 referred by the legislature. The other measures are initiatives that have the numbers 32 through 36, and they were proposed by groups of citizens who got enough petitions signed to qualify for the ballot. The first subject, a substantive subject we're going to talk about, are local taxes. The reason we're going to start with the local taxes is because it affects the population of our localities most directly. You can see that there's several kinds of taxes. There's sales tax, there's parcel taxes, which is what is used to finance bonds. And you will note that any sort of a special tax is a tax that is devoted to one or more particular purposes, as opposed to being placed into the general fund of the entity. What we have are general taxes, which require a majority vote. Special taxes require 2/3 vote. I don't think we have any special taxes on the ballot this election locally. You will note what we do have is we have sales tax increase proposal, and we have a number of transient occupancy tax increase proposals. Go to the next slide now. I'm going to leave this slide up for a bit. I'm just going to run through the local taxes and bonds that are on the November ballot. Each is going to appear just in one jurisdiction with one notable exception. Measure L is the College School District. It's an $18 million school facilities bonds. All school facilities bonds have various things in common. They require a 55% voter approval. They have mandatory oversight. They're required to have a specific plan for the use of the funds, and they are limited to the purposes that are identified in that plan. It's a state statute that enables school districts and community college districts to finance their facilities, not salaries. They can't pay for salaries and things like that with bond proceeds. They can only use it to construct facilities. In that category, in addition to the college school district, you have the Hope School District with a $40 million bond. Lompoc Unified have a $160 million bond. I would note with respect to Lompoc that is bond measure is pretty strongly endorsed, not only by the school district but by the city, I believe. The Santa Barbara College District, City College District, $198 million bond, which extends the existing parcel tax. We're going to talk about that in a bit of detail. And Santa Maria has two bonds, one for the high school district for classroom repair with about $194 million, and one for the school district, Santa Maria Bonita School District, for $77 million. All of those are local school bonds, and basically you approach local school bonds the same way. We'll talk about it in a little bit of detail when we talk about Measure P. The other thing that's on the ballot that is of note are general taxes. These require a majority vote. There is one sales tax increase, that's Measure I of the City of Santa Barbara. And if I count right, 1, 2, 3, 4 increases in the transient occupancy taxes, 3 of which go from 12% to 14%, and 1 of which, the City of Carpinteria, goes from 12% to 15%. Transient occupancy taxes, again, all of these are general taxes. They're not always general taxes, but all of these happen to be general taxes. The thing that is of note, and people in your ballots are going to notice this, Measure H is the county measure to increase the transient occupancy tax to 14%. It is voted on countywide. People who live in cities vote on it, but it only applies and is paid by people that operate hotels, motels, vacation rentals, etc., in unincorporated areas. But it's a county ordinance, so everybody in the county gets to vote on it. Let's go with the next slide. Okay. This is just a slide that shows you the components. We're going to talk about Measure I a bit. This just shows you the components of the state sales tax law. You will notice that about half of it, almost 4%, is the state general fund revenue. You will also notice the next 3 categories talk about something called realignment or public safety fund. All that share of taxes goes to fund public safety in one form or another. Then there's a uniform 1 cent that goes to local governments, and a 1/4 cent for our county's transportation fund. The remainder of the allowable sales tax under state law can vary from 0% to 3.5% optional local tax. So the maximum sales tax that any jurisdiction can have is 10.75%. The current rate for the City of Santa Barbara is 8.75%. And the slide shows you that where in the municipal code you can find the tax ordinance. The current rate for the county is 7.75%. Let's get to the next slide. This is a slide that shows you the basic points of Measure I. It's a sales tax increase. It's called the Santa Barbara Essential Local Services Measure. And the basic points are pretty straightforward. The city has a budget deficit that is estimated at between $7 and about $10 million. Budget deficit, meaning while their revenue increased slightly, their expenses increased more than their revenue did, so that they have $7 to $10 million less available than they need to pay for their ongoing programs and expenses. I would note that about 31%, I can't remember where I got the figure from, but about 31% of city revenue comes from sales tax. What is proposed by the city council, and bear in mind you have to have a supermajority vote of the council to put a tax measure on the ballot. What is proposed is a half-cent sales tax from 8.75% to 9.25%, which is estimated to raise, on an annual basis, I believe, $15.6 million. You will notice when you see your ballot that there is a listing of potential uses for revenue, including general government purposes. That's the magic language in the ballot language, because it indicates that this indeed is a general tax, although the city council and the city officials are giving you an indication of the uses that the tax money may be spent on. There's also, I believe it's either a resolution or a vote of a list of priorities that says the things that the council values. Notably at the top of them are depositing funds in the Housing Trust Fund to finance certain measures that will help with the housing affordability in the city, which is everyone recognizes as a major problem. The other thing that is of note is that a portion of this money is expected to fund or finance at least a part of the new police station that the council is determined to go ahead with. So there's at least two of the things it's going to be used for. Can be used for a number of other things. The pros and cons arguments with respect to sales taxes are generally pretty simple. The first question you ask is whether the money is necessary, whether you need the money. The argument in favor of the sales tax is that the budget deficit is indeed real, that the sales tax is the broadest based and most productive in terms of dollars tax. It'll meet the deficit and fund needed projects and programs, and it is pointed out that both residents and visitors pay sales tax. People that come to town, they pay a transient occupancy tax where they stay, but then they pay sales tax for the food that they eat in restaurants. You don't pay sales tax for raw food. You should note that. The con argument, there's a couple con arguments, and we got a separate slide on it. The first con argument is that the city has wasted a lot of money on consultants. They haven't done anything on State Street. They've been inefficient, and their inefficiency shouldn't be rewarded by a tax increase. People that oppose the sales tax increase generally point out that sales taxes are regressive. Regressive meaning that if you raise everybody's tax by 0.5 cent, the people at the bottom of the economic scale who make less money will be harder hit by a sales tax, relatively speaking, than people who have more money. That's what they call a regressive tax increase. Go to the next slide and we'll get into a little more detail about this. Oh no, we won't. Can I go back to the previous slide here? Here we go. Well, note that generally speaking, the main thing that voters are concerned about when they consider a sales tax increase or other kind of general tax increase is whether they trust the government body to spend the money wisely. That's because it's not earmarked for a particular purpose. So you have to trust, in our case, the city council, to wisely spend our sales tax dollars. Let's get to the next slide, which is the City College Facilities Bond. That's Measure P. Measure P is proposing a school facilities bond, again 55% voter approval necessary. It is restricted to a specific plan with a long list of projects. Notably missing from that specific plan is housing. You'll notice there's no housing proposed. It's all facilities. And there is a required oversight committee that has to be established with the funds. I urge you, as with all school bonds, read them carefully, read the ballot carefully, especially read the plan carefully so that you can understand the list of projects, what they're going to spend your money for. In City College's case, it's a $198 million bond to repair and upgrade aging college facilities, a long list of facilities. It does not increase taxes, but it does extend the approved tax rate, which is a parcel tax, of $808.50 per $100,000 of assessed value. That's not market value, that's the assessed value of the property, and it is estimated to generate about $13 million annually. Continues the existing parcel tax. I would note that in the state school tax, facilities bond law, bond proceeds cannot be spent on salaries or administration. They have to be spent on facilities. We have a couple of slides on the argument here. This is the summary. The pro is real simple. The facilities are really old, they're badly in need of repair, and the funding is badly needed to provide the main functions of the city college, vocational training and education. And again, the spending is subject to oversight. The con argument, let me go back to, because there's two con arguments. Good. We go back one slide. There you go. The first con argument is pretty simple. City College has wasted a lot of money and failed to do anything with its previous plans. The salaries are too high, and the facilities plan is a bait and switch. What the trustees really want to do is build housing for out-of-towners, whereas the college should focus on local students. There is a slightly more sophisticated set of arguments for and pro and con. Next. Could I have the next slide? There you go. The pro argument, and you can find this at the City College website. They go into great detail about what they're going to do with it. Nearly half of our local students rely on community colleges for three things. Well, two of them, they're students. That's affordable higher education for people that can't afford state universities or private colleges, and vocational training, importantly for modern types of careers, nursing, food services, marine industries of various types. They also would note that in addition to the main City College campus, there's two campuses that provide a wide range of adult education and community programs. I suppose at this point, in the interest of full disclosure, I should reveal that while I am not enrolled in City College, I am in fact a low bass in the award-winning, internationally famous City College Concert Choir. Again, the proponents stress that the facilities are in bad repair and really need long-term financing. The con argument is there's another con argument that's a little bit different than the previous one. That says this is addressing the wrong question. The real problem with City College that they're facing is that their enrollment has declined precipitously since COVID, and further since COVID, a substantially higher percentage of their students are online. The real problem is there's too many buildings in poor shape, but they have both facilities problems and they have staff financing problems. And what they really need to do is to figure out how to fix their structural revenue gap. The plan for Proposition P, in the view of these opponents, does not identify the real problem, but rather spends a big chunk of money on athletic facilities, which are among the facilities that serve the fewest students, rather than creatively try to deal with the problems that the City College actually faces. Let's see. At this point, I would ask my distinguished colleague Claire von Blaricum to check the chat and see if we have any questions about any of the foregoing.
So far, no questions at all. You must be doing an excellent job of explaining things. So let's move on.
Claire is checking the chat.
I checked the chat. There's nothing there. No one has posed a question as yet.
Can we keep going? Apparently we have no questions in the chat.
No, there are no questions in the chat.
The next, just very briefly, local measures other than taxes. There are three measures that of note. There's a measure in Buellton that extends and expands their urban growth boundary. I would recommend that all people in Buellton check the map and see if you like where they're expanding the boundary to. There's a measure in Goleta, the Agricultural Land Initiative Extension Measure, which does exactly what it says. There is an existing measure that protects, requires voter approval to redesignate or change the intensity of use for large ag parcels, extends this for 20 additional years. Won't take effect until 2032. And there are two interesting measures in Lompoc, both of which would allow creation of a privately owned space education center on Ken Adam Public Park. There's two measures. Measure Q, which is done by the City Council, actually approves a development agreement. There's a citizen initiative that authorizes the private use of the park, but does not specifically approve the center.
May I interrupt for a moment, Shane? I have something from the Q&A portion of the Zoom portion that are telling me that the chat apparently is disabled. So TV Santa Barbara, can we correct that, please?
Well, we'll move on. We're going to get to the state measures at this point. I'm assuming I have the high sign to keep going. This is word salad. It is brought to you courtesy of the League of Women Voters of California. I will note, I won't attempt to undress this salad. I will note that all state measures that you're going to see require majority voter approval. We shall take them in order. They start with Proposition 2. You might remember Proposition 1 was the only measure on the March ballot, and it was a big reworking of the state mental health services law. Comes back into the picture at the end of our program, as you will see. Proposition 2, the first of the state measures, is a big $10 billion state bond for schools and community colleges. It's exactly what it says it is. It's a bond act. The state finances long-term matters with debt. They argue a great deal about how much debt they can have. This particular thing primarily finances a share of local school facilities projects, mostly schools, also community colleges. The basics of Proposition 2, I would call to your attention, if you really want to know the details of what the $10 billion is going to be spent for, beyond the basic division of $8.5 billion for K through 12 schools and $1.5 billion for community colleges, you should look at AB 247. AB 247 is the statute that says in detail how the bond proceeds are spent, and you can evaluate whether you think that's good use for the $10 billion bond fund. You will note that with this bond, it will cost the state about $500 million a year to pay off for 35 years to pay off the bond. So the $10 million bond is going to cost about $17 million with some adjustment for the effect of inflation that goes into it. That's generally speaking what happens with bonds. I note that I've been advised by my art critic AI chatbot, the great Vodomama, that the books in the previous slide are cute and that the pictures are appropriate, but the little pig for the fiscal effects is questionable. Okay, a little art criticism there. Let's go to the next, the arguments. It's pretty straightforward. The supporters say the bonds will help pay for badly needed repairs and security improvements, making schools and community colleges safer and a better environment for education. The opponents say that costs too much money. It makes taxpayers pay bond interest over many years, and the money will go to wasteful construction projects instead of classroom instruction. So you can see there's two ways of looking at whether you want to go for the bonds. Going next. The next proposition is Proposition 3. This amends Article 1, Declaration of Rights. There's a couple of bond measures from the state, and there are a couple of amendments to the Declaration of Rights. This is the first one. It's a little twisty, but what it does is pretty straightforward. It strikes from the Constitution language that says that marriage is only between a man and a woman, which was put in the Constitution by an initiative some years ago. I would point out that, we've got to get the next slide up there, that particular language was declared unconstitutional, both by the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court held that the language could remain, but it was unenforceable. It didn't affect any actual rights, and we now allow same-sex marriages to be performed. The United States Supreme Court has affirmed the rights of same-sex marriage, but I would point out that there are indications in the recent Dobbs decision, particularly an opinion by Justice Thomas, that indicates a hostility for the concept of something called substantive due process, which sounds oxymoronic, but is basically a doctrine that has been used to indicate that a person's property rights not only have a procedural component, but a substantive component when a regulation goes too far or interferes with somebody's privacy rights. The Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, expressed hostility towards that. Therefore, the legislature of California has modified or proposes to modify the language of the Declaration of Rights that defines marriage so that it simply says marriage is a fundamental right and deletes the language regarding marriage being only between a man and a woman. The supporters say that just affirms marriage equality and makes sure that it's firmly rooted in the state constitution and will protect the fundamental right to marry regardless of gender or race. There is opposition. Opponents say there's no need for that. Same-sex marriage is already legal. And that this is an argument which I think is pretty thin now that I looked at it, is that Proposition 3 removes all rules for marriage, opening the door to child marriage, incest, and polygamy. I would point out that all of those things are prohibited explicitly by the Family Code, and I wouldn't think, although you never know, I wouldn't think that simply redefining the fundamental right would repeal those other things, but that's the argument. The next state proposition is Proposition 4. Proposition 4 is another big $10 billion bond. This one's a 40-year bond, $10 billion, and it goes for a variety of different kinds of projects, all of which have in common that they're intended to improve emergency protection, wildfire prevention, safe drinking water, and other kinds of public safety measures. Again, there is a state statute, I believe it's SB 867, 867 that tells you in detail. It adds a division to the Public Resources Code, and it tells you in detail all the various things that this bond will be used for. Whoops. It's pretty straightforward, actually. You can see it. If you turn on your television and look at the weather in Florida and North Carolina, you get a pretty good idea about the effects of climate change. It's pretty hard to deny. It certainly is negatively affecting Californians. That's the situation and why their state is proposing a large bond project for things that relate to things that will improve our resilience against the effect of climate change. Again, this costs $400 million, or excuse me, get that right, $400 million a year for 40 years to repay the bond. Has similar economics as to the education bond. And again, if they're right and they save a lot of money by protecting against natural disasters, you got to offset that against the cost of the bond, or you might. I have lost my screen here. Slide. I'll wing it here. The arguments for that, it's pretty self-explanatory. It'll help protect the communities. That's what bonds are for. Big scale infrastructure that's supposed to have long-term benefits. Next slide. The opponents, again, they say it's expensive, shouldn't be used. It's the most expensive way to finance government spending. And again, the stuff they're trying to finance is for unproven technologies without a real evidence of success. Give me a minute. Here we go. We should be at Proposition 5. Proposition 5 is an interesting proposition. We'll talk a little bit about it. It's simple to explain. You can see the little house graphic, nice house graphic up top. It applies to local affordable housing and infrastructure measures. These are by cities and counties in addition to school bonds. The same 55% voter approval instead of the 66% approval that is currently required to pass special taxes and bonds. And it amends several sections of the California Constitution to do this. Next slide. Pretty simple. This is what it does. It won't have much effect on the state budget, but it'll have a big effect on local budgets. Should explain something here. They're 100% of the electorate. Some percentage of the electorate are always going to vote in favor of every tax. Some percentage of the electorate is always going to vote against every tax. And then there's the majority of the electorate in the middle, which can be persuaded one way or the other. There's a pretty big difference between what it takes to get 55% of the voters to agree with you and what it takes to get 2/3 of the voters to give you. It's more than like a 10% difference. It's a significant electoral advantage. At least that's according to consultants. We're neutral on the concept of consultants, but that's generally what they tell you. Next slide. Here's the argument for it. It makes sense. Local infrastructure, affordable housing, desperately needed, should have the same kind of quality of voter approval and the same guardrails, the oversight, the limitation to what's in your plan. As with the school bonds, it's 2/3 is just too difficult of a hurdle for these vital local projects to overcome on a regular basis. The opponents basically say, hey, wait a minute, we have a protection for debt. It's in the Constitution. It's a 2/3 vote. In Prop 5, it pushes the infrastructure costs onto local governments and taxpayers. You will also hear the argument, which is related to what I just said, that it amends Proposition 13 or it weakens Proposition 13. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. Forgive me for some discursive technicalities. Should be on that. Should be on there you go. Should be on the next slide. Before 1978, which I will tell you is right about the time when I started working for local government in California, 1978. Cities and school districts financed their operations by levying property taxes. There was a big public revolt against that. Proposition 13 changed all that. It put three big rules. Proposition 13 was passed, I think it was April 1978, might have been June of 78. It did three main things. It changed the system so that it's based on your base year value, the value when you acquired the property. It restricts the rate of increase on your assessments to no greater than 2% each year, and it limits property taxes to 1% of assessed value, plus any additional local voter-approved taxes you want to do it. In fact, Proposition 13 has been amended a bunch of times. The several sections of the Constitution that adopted. It has come to be a political shorthand for a bundle of property owners' rights against imposition of government taxation. There have been several amendments related to a very complicated subject of property transfers between generations. The main change to Proposition 13 is Proposition 218, which is also known as the Right to Vote on Taxes Act. This added two important articles to the Constitution. Article 13C, which provides specific limits on local taxes, special and general, and Article 13D, which has very specific procedures for property assessments and how they can be calculated. A later amendment initiative, Proposition 26, added additional limitations on government revenue raising. That's the context within which Proposition 5 is proposed. Yes, it further diverts from the original protections in Prop 13 and Prop 218, but it's not all that unusual for the Proposition 13 to be amended. It's happened a few times. So I would suggest that you look at Prop 5 on its merits, whether you think it's a good thing to do to reduce the voter approval level for local housing and infrastructure bonds. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, we have more.
Shane?
Yes.
Can we stop for questions? I have a few for you.
Okay, well, let me do this slide, then we do the questions. How's that?
Very good.
Okay. There you go. She mentioned just a little mention about the schools. Before Prop 13, school districts used to impose their own property taxes. That didn't work. With Proposition 13, the state had to bail out schools. Proposition 98 came along in 1998, full 20 years after Prop 13. That guarantees schools through community college about 40% share of state income tax revenue. Repeat, state income tax revenue. I think there are 4 people in the state that actually know how the schools are financed. They're not talking much. It's very complicated and it changes from year to year in the details of it. But in any event, the income tax and the formulas of how it's manipulated, the school share is manipulated, has become the primary way of financing the schools. The 55% school bonds came along a few years later in 2002, and Prop 5 would apply this approval level with the oversight and specificity to the infrastructure and affordable housing bonds and partial taxes. I would a tip for next elections be 2026 when the next set of state measures come along. You can expect for another bunch of measures relating to how local government and state government is financed and taxation in 2026, including a new version of the Taxpayer Protection Act, which is another matter from industrial and landlord interests that the Supreme Court held was so severe that it constituted a revision rather than an amendment of the Constitution, kept it on the ballot. Keep your eyes open for next year. Claire, we have questions?
We do. I wanted to get them in before we get too far.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay. The first couple of questions actually deal back with the local bond issues that you were talking about. One says, is this a duplication of our local bonds for K-12 and Santa Barbara City College? And I'm assuming that that refers to Measure P.
Yes, it is. And it's an extension. It's not a duplication. It adds on to it. So I guess you could argue it's a duplication, but it's a new bond measure.
Okay.
It's new money.
That answers the second question, too, that says, it seems that the local initiative Measure P would hope to leverage their funds to grab funds potentially generated by Prop 2. So if you support P, should you also support Prop 2?
My understanding is that Prop 2 is designed to pump money into the overall state school system to facilitate local measures by paying a share of that. Does that answer your question?
I think it does.
The existence of the state bond does not take away money from the existence of the local bonds. But
by having the local bond, they may be eligible for some funds from Prop 2.
A share,
correct?
Yes. Having the local bonds, my understanding is, increases the ability of local districts, community college and school districts, to get state financing to assist in their construction projects.
Okay, very good. Okay, two more questions. Does Prop 4, this is on the state initiatives, does Prop 4 allow salaries to be paid too? So the economics would end up paying twice as much over the bond period? Question mark.
I would have to take a pretty close look at the details of the statute for Proposition 4. There are a number of categories of things that can be financed with that state bond money, and they're generally grant programs. Grant programs, there's no restriction or prohibition on financing salaries and administration with your grant money, although I think that probably the preference would be to give the money to things that are harder and more permanent in nature than salary bonds.
Okay, the next question deals with Prop 5. Prop 5 could benefit city as a way of replacing the redevelopment agency revenues that City of Santa Barbara lost to produce affordable housing. Well, I guess it's more of a statement, but I guess we could pose it as a question. Does Prop 5 potentially benefit the city as a way of replacing the redevelopment agency revenues that the City of Santa Barbara lost to produce affordable housing?
Well, it's different. It's an interesting point of view. It doesn't really replace redevelopment agencies. Redevelopment agencies were given with a steady stream of property tax increment that could be used to finance any one of a number of projects. Bond financing is a little bit different. There you go, project by project, and you incur debt and interest in order to finance the infrastructure. It certainly is intended to make it easier for cities and counties that don't have redevelopment revenue coming in to get their projects approved, their affordable housing projects approved. That's clear. I mean, it makes up for a difficulty or it helps relieve the exacerbation of the difficulty that cities have in getting housing projects approved. I'm not sure that it really replaces either in type or in quantity redevelopment revenue.
I will bow out then until we have more questions.
Okay. We're ready for the next one. Thank you, Claire. The next is Proposition 6. This is the last of the legislative referred constitutional amendments, and like Proposition 3, it amends the Declaration of Rights. It's a little bit different. It amends the section of the Constitution that provides, I think I'm not quite memorized it, but it's pretty short, so it's close. The Constitution now prohibits slavery, and it prohibits involuntary servitude except for punishment for crime. Proposition 6 would eliminate that exception. It would eliminate the exception of involuntary servitude for incarcerated persons. It would be accompanied, next slide, it would be accompanied by a statute which would go into effect if it passes, which sets conditions for how you go about calculating voluntary labor in prisons. So in other words, you can't make an incarcerated person work, but there's a whole set of circumstances in which you can offer them employment, and there's consequences if you refuse employment, but you're taking the allowance of involuntary servitude out of the Constitution. The financial effect of this is uncertain, and there's a big unknown, which is how the minimum wage requirements apply to this. It's not entirely clear that the prisoners would be paid minimum wage or not. It's an unknown and would be addressed later on, probably either by the legislature, possibly through the courts. Anyway, that's the proposal. I would point out, we got the next slide up there, that the end of forced labor of people in jails restores human dignity and human rights, as well as improving public safety by focusing on rehabilitation. I would note that this was a recommendation of the Reparations Commission, which pointed out long time invidious discrimination and repression of black people in the prison system, and this is an artifact of it, and they recommended the Constitution be changed in the matter that's proposed. That's what the supporters say. There was no argument against Proposition 6, probably because nobody is going to say, frankly, nobody's going to say a good word about slavery. It's pretty hard to justify. You can expect somewhere down the line that there's going to be some grumbling about the increased expense of the proposal, particularly if it's decided that inmates are entitled to minimum wage. We're rolling along here. Let's get to the next the set. You will notice these. Now we go to the initiatives, and you can see that the numbers have jumped because the statute says that initiatives go serially up from the last one that was done. Legislature is not bound by that, so they tend to put low numbers on their propositions that they refer, kind of like running backs. We get to Proposition 32. Here. Proposition 32 raises the minimum wage. It does so to raise it to $18 an hour incrementally. It hits $18 an hour in January 1st, 2026, and then thereafter would go up each year based on cost of living increase or inflation. Now the statewide minimum wage is $16 an hour. Notably, certain industries and cities have established higher minimum wages. For example, now it's a $20 minimum wage for fast food workers, I believe. If you're already making over $18 an hour, it won't lower your wage. That's the proposal. And not surprisingly, it's going to increase government costs and decrease revenues. We could save some money if state services are not used. The supporters say it'll raise the standard of living, improve the standard for millions of workers, and promote economic fairness. Next, we got opponents. The opponents say it'll hurt businesses, raise prices, and cause job losses. And if governments pay more wages, taxes may go up. Those are the arguments against it. Pretty straightforward. Next, we get to rent control. We spent a little bit of time on this. Proposition 33 is an initiative. This is the third time this initiative has been on the state ballot. It repeals one particular rent control law, the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act of 1995. And it has two main provisions. One, it repeals that law. And two is it prohibits state government in the future from interfering with local rent control. That's a slippery term, and it doesn't stop state government from legislating in matters that aren't considered rent control. For example, eviction protection is not necessarily rent control. In fact, it isn't rent control. Let's go into what it says. The Costa-Hawkins law has several main features. The main feature, its distinguishing feature, is that it allows the landlord to set the rent upon vacancy. It's called vacancy decontrol. The practical effect, or the practical legal effect of that, is that it enables cities and counties who have rent control laws to avoid takings claims, because it allows the landlord to get back in whatever income has been lost as a result of the controls by having the ability to set the rent on vacancy. The proposal is to stop that and allow local governments to enact their own rent control laws subject to constitutional protections, and there are two big ones, they're related. One is the right to due process, which is a right to have your case heard. You have a right to a hearing and to be able to make your case, opportunity to be heard. And the other is takings. Takings There's a couple kinds of takings. It's really complicated, but the basic rule is the government cannot deprive you of substantially all of the value of your property. And if they do, that constitutes a taking because it violates, here we go again, substantive due process. In any event, there's constitutional rights, and the governments, local governments, still have to follow them. Let's get with the arguments. The arguments are pretty simple, I will say here. Please ignore these ads that you see on television. Read the laws, read the comments, read what people say, pro and con. The ads are way over the top. They got an ad, I can't remember if it's for rent control or anti-rent control. It's got the song California Dreamin' on it. Great song, has very little to do with the mechanics of this highly complicated technical initiative. Supporters will say, hey, with rent's too high, Prop 33 will allow local governments to protect their renters, and local voters will be able to decide this. The opponents, they say that Prop 33 will increase the cost to build the housing for a couple different reasons, makes the housing crisis worse, and drive up costs both for renters and home buyers. I'll give you some notes here on the technicality of this. The Prop 33 will repeal Costa-Hawkins Rental Act. It will remove its prohibition on regulating post-1995 buildings, which is what it says now, and single-family homes, and will also remove the right to set the rate on vacancy. The case law says that it not only preempts, Costa-Hawkins preempts means prohibits the local governments from interfering with the state regulation. Affordable housing requirements that have the effect of interfering with a landlord's right to set rents on vacancy. There's an exception for a statute called the Ellis Act, which gives the landlord a right to go out of business, but allows the existing tenants to return if he decides to go back into the rental market. Other rental housing laws, this is very important. Other rental housing laws, particularly the Tenant Protection Act, which is a fairly recent statute, it's AB 1482, if you want to look at the details of what it says. That's an existing state law. It expires in 2030. It's not affected by Proposition 33. It has a rent cap of 5% plus the cost of living, or up to 10%, whichever is lower. The right to set the rent on vacancy, and it has a prohibition on regulation buildings that have certificates of occupancy newer than 15 years. This 15-year period is supposed to be the key to financing the new housing because it allows, so it is said, the owners to accrue some profit before rent control kicks in and therefore lets their projects pencil out. As I mentioned before, the vacancy decontrol allows cities to avoid takings claims. Importantly, Prop 33 bars the state from future limits on local rent control. Local governments that adopt rent control, if it passes, would not be restricted by the Tenant Protection Act limits, but they still have to respect their constitutional property rights. I would note that while you can do it, you can craft a system that respects owners' property rights, affords them a fair return. But the main way to do it requires two things. It requires a lot of process and it requires a lot of people. It's not cheap. It's not a cheap way of regulating. Vacancy decontrol requires virtually nothing to cost. It's a real policy dispute, and in good faith arguments on both sides. And if you've been tracking our city council races for the city of Santa Barbara at least, you will note that rent control is a very important issue. It's very near and dear to the hearts of people who live here. Do we have any questions? I asked for a chat about Prop 33. Do we have any rent control questions?
Yes, we do. We have two questions. The first one is, does Prop 33 repeal the cap on increasing rents on existing tenants of 5% a year, I think?
I think I just answered that. No, it does not. There are television commercials which say it'll repeal hundreds of laws. It doesn't repeal hundreds of laws. The only way it could be held to repeal some law other than Costa-Hawkins is if a court finds that it impliedly repeals it. And that's a very, very difficult barrier to meet. So I actually talked to the primary drafter of Prop 33, and she was clearly of the opinion, I mean, I asked her straight out if it repealed AB 1482, which is the statute with the cap, and she said unequivocally no. So you can listen to that argument, but I don't think it holds a lot of water.
Okay. The other question is essentially a statement. Says, Mr. Stark, my rule of thumb comes from what you said to audiences in a previous League of Women Voters Pros and Cons forum. If you don't understand it, don't vote for it. Do you think that applies to Prop 33?
It's good advice. It is generally good advice. Let me preach for a moment, not too loud. Generally speaking, when you are voting on an initiative, you're in the shoes of the legislature. It's serious business. If you want to pass a law, it's very difficult to change the law once the voters pass it. So as a general guideline, it's prudent. If you don't understand the law, vote against it. Or don't vote. It's okay not to vote if you don't understand the law that you're asked to approve. Is that a sufficient answer there?
Those are the two questions. I will bow out again until the next round.
We're rocking. Okay. Proposition 34 has an interesting twist to it. It is very complicated. It has a very narrow exception to the rule that provisions that healthcare providers, how they spend their money. This would say if you meet certain qualifications, and they're very narrowly drawn so that they apparently apply only to a small number of companies, maybe only the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which is the proponent of Proposition 33, as well as the other attempts to repeal Costa-Hawkins. They're in the rental housing business. What Prop 34 does, let's see if we can get it up here. The money for healthcare providers, they have specific rules about how they can spend money. And in particularly, if you had a certain amount of violations for housing violations, you can't spend more than 2% of your funds on things other than direct housing costs. Or direct drug costs. It's pretty restrictive. And there was an attempt by the sponsors of Prop 33 to keep it off the ballot. That was unsuccessful. There will probably be another lawsuit that will attempt to declare it unconstitutional. I wouldn't want to speculate about how that would go. On the face of it, it looks like a regulation that narrows how healthcare providers can spend their money. But the subtext in it is that it's aimed against the AIDS Healthcare Foundation in order to deter them from their initiative efforts. So it's got a sort of a constitutional overtone to it. Let's see what the supporters say this will just ensure that the money from the discounted drug program is used for direct care and will make the discount program permanent, while the opponents say that it just targets one provider that supports rent control, and that federal law already allows profits from drug discounts to support any nonprofit mission of healthcare providers. Let's go to Proposition 35. It's another pretty complicated one, and maybe your astute listeners will come back to some of the other things I said about ballot box budgeting with this one here. Proposition 35 is an initiative that sponsored mostly by the healthcare industry. There is an existing tax on managed healthcare plans called an MCO tax, Managed Care Organization. And the state uses that tax to pay for a good part of its share of Medi-Cal. The tax is generally reinstituted by the legislature on a regular basis. This year, the governor devoted a big chunk of that money to fund other programs that were on the chopping block because of the state's budget deficit. This caused the medical industry to place, which, as anybody's tried to get an appointment with a doctor can tell you, the medical industry is suffering. It's hard to get doctors, it's hard to get nurses, cost of housing is great. They need help. And to help them improve doctors, they have passed this initiative or proposed this initiative that proposes how the money is going to be spent. It's spent directly on patient health care. It's a little complicated what the financial effect of it is. It catches the increased costs and lack of flexibility will show up in a couple of years, and they're saying that it's going to that if this passes, it'll increase about $2 to $5 billion per year to fund other health programs. But that won't kick in for a few years, and that there will be additional costs to cover services that were not included in Proposition 35. Let's see what we got. Oh, note there's a typo there. It's just what the supporters say. It should say Prop 35 instead of Prop 33. It's pretty self-explanatory why they want it. The opponent, no argument against Prop 35 was submitted. However, you will note, you got the next slide, please, that the existing budget package takes most of the tax to offset the general fund spending and maintain existing services. There's a plan for rate increases, but it's a decrease in workforce investments. Proposition 35 overturns the budget, overturns the plan, and establishes rules for how the tax revenue would be spent for the short term and beyond. The key difference is that lawmakers would no longer be able to use funds to offset general fund spending. It's generally referred to as an argument against ballot box budgeting. It's generally thought of that it's a bad practice for your budget, which is supposed to be flexible enough to meet your needs from year to year, to be permanently dedicated to one fund to the extent of another. There are numerous exceptions to that that have been adopted in the state constitution. If you're really interested in the details, the gritty details of this, there is a useful publication called Understanding Proposition 35 from the California Budget and Policy Center. So if you're real curious about it, I recommend that you read that thing in that paper and make up your mind. And that's the argument. The medical industry is strongly in favor of Prop 35 as it ensures the dollars are directed to patient care. The governor and others oppose Prop 35. It said it's ballot box budgeting that impairs flexibility as well as overturning commitments to fund services with MCO tax dollars. Do we have any questions about this in the chats? We're on to our last proposition. Going to end right on time.
We have one question.
Fire away.
It says, what should we take from the voter pamphlet that there is no con argument to Prop 35?
I wouldn't take it from. In fact, there, as I mentioned, there is opposition to Prop 35. I don't know why there was no argument, but there, in fact, are entities like the governor, right, a pretty big opponent, who do oppose this. And generally it's based on the principle against that they don't like ballot box budgeting. Ballot box budgeting.
That's a tongue twister.
Yeah.
Well, that concludes the questions.
Yep. We got one more proposition to go, and it's a good one.
Okay. I will bow out again.
Or a bad one, depending on your perspective, I suppose. Okay. Next one is Proposition 36. Proposition 36, very interesting proposition. See what it says here. Proposition 36 would allow felony charges and increased sentences for certain, I believe there's 11, there are 10 or 11 specific sections of the penal code. There may be the health and safety code as well. Drug and theft crimes. And the next, we probably have to go in a little history on this. In fact, let me jump ahead a couple of slides and do the history first. The first effort to make sure that local law enforcement was sufficiently funded came in the 1990s, where there was a realignment in the 1990s. In the late 2000s, the pressure on the state in terms of a lawsuit, big lawsuit, was to reduce its prison population substantially because of the degree of overcrowding of the state prisons was sharply criticized by the federal courts. They're set upon a number of things to do, and one of the things that they did is they adopted something called realignment to 2011, because that's when it was adopted. And what it does is it changes responsibility for certain low-level crimes to the counties, primarily to the counties, from the state, and it creates a fund to allocate sales tax, about 1% and a bit of sales tax and some car tax, to fund a bunch of different public safety and health services. If you want to know the painful language of that, you can check Government Code Section 30,025, 30025. And it tells you exactly how these law enforcement services are funded. In 2014, Proposition 47 came along. Proposition 47 reduced the penalties for certain nonviolent offenses, notably shoplifting and drug crimes. It created a fund called the Safe Neighborhood and Schools Funds to finance grants for specific education, mental health, let's go back a couple slides, mental health and substance abuse services. And the way that works is that the finance director every year calculates how much money the state saved, because people who would have gone to state prison are now being served in the community or county facilities. And they take that money and they put it in this fund, and they fund a bunch of specific programs for education, mental health, and substance abuse services. Proposition 36 increases the penalties and prescribes state prison sentences for specified drug and theft crimes, notably shoplifting. And the big problem, because there is no doubt that after Proposition 47 was passed, and then particularly after COVID, that there was a big simultaneous increase in the severity of big store organized theft, shoplifting, phrase, and a lack of enforcement of misdemeanor penalties. The courts weren't handing out big sentences, and prosecutors weren't prosecuting misdemeanors. That led to Proposition 36 to increase the penalties. If it's implemented, Proposition 36 is going to have the effect, probably, of sending more people to prison, as opposed to people that otherwise would go to the county correctional system, and the fund that funds all these programs is probably going to dry up. There's another factor as well. Give me the next slide. Proposition 36, in addition to raising the limits, sentencing limits, creates something called a treatment mandated felony, which is a crime that is basically a repeat drug offense, which you can, if you do that, then you go through this whole complicated program of rehabilitation with court-ordered services of various types, addiction experts, caseworkers, health evaluations, and mandatory court hearings. And if you finish it, you get your license, you do it successfully, they wipe out your crime and you're rehabilitated, and presumably you're going to resume society as a productive measure, and if you fail, you go to prison. This probably is going to decrease the Prop 47 savings. There's a provision in Proposition 36 that says that they can use both local revenue 2011 funds, the regular law enforcement stuff, and the Safe Neighborhood and Streets funds to pay for that. If you don't have those funds, you're gonna if you've got services and you're gonna lack funding, you're gonna have to look elsewhere. That's a tricky part of this. The pundits that purport to know stuff about this will tell you that it's a real shame that the legislature and the governor and the sponsors of Prop 36 didn't reach a compromise. The legislature passed 13 separate anti-crime bills. They don't directly conflict with Prop 36, but they sort of cover the same ground. And what the legislative package does is it leaves the Prop 47 provisions for the realignment alone. So the governor and criminal justice advocates, public defenders, etc., oppose Prop 36. They say it's regressive, while law enforcement advocates, district attorneys, pretty much unanimously continue to support it. See if there's anything else we need to say about it. Give you the arguments. The supporters say it makes communities safer, holds repeat thieves accountable, make them serve tougher sentences. That's a tough sentence right there. And the opponents say that it will make California less safe by stopping crime prevention and drug treatment programs and will cost billions. Are there any, Claire, are there any questions about Prop 36?
No, we have no questions about Prop 36, but we do have an excellent question for the end of the pros and cons forum.
Well, that's cool. Let's go to the next slide then. It's got a dog.
Let's see it.
No guidance from the State League as to the meaning, ownership, breed, or anything else having to do with that. Dog, I presume, is casting a vote. Any?
Okay. Anyway, the question that is posed, where do I find the League of Women Voters of California positions on the various propositions?
I believe, do you know? I believe you can check they're on our website.
They're on our website. The League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara website, which is lwvsantabarbara.org, has a link through to the Vote with the League information from League of Women Voters of California, or you can go directly to the League of Women Voters of California website. You'd have to Google it. I don't have the exact web address in my mind at the moment. And they will have on that website very prominently the Vote with the League listing that does give the League's position on various propositions. We have not necessarily taken a position on each one, but those that we have taken a position on will be there for you to see.
Thank you. And the dog is saying goodbye and wishing everybody to vote. Would note the next slide, another pitch for vote411.org. Get all your election information. And the last, I want to thank TVSB, Sylvia Uribe for translation, and our great voter service team, Reve Moran, Claire Von Blaricum, and thank you for your interest in informed democracy and for your attendance here. This very important election. Please make sure that you are correctly registered and vote. Your vote counts and counts more than ever. So please get out here and vote.
We might mention that Vote 411 is a way of finding out information on local candidates as well as local issues. Vote411.org. You put in your address and information comes up that have been put in from the various candidates that will appear on your particular ballot. So thank you and good night.
Night.